We are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the, I can't tell you what number it is because we've done so many replacement classes and extra classes, but it's the latest seminar of Ben Bratton's The Stack to Come, Synthetic Sensing, Intelligence, and the New Normal. Today, we have a special guest for the seminar. Nick Land is joining us from Shanghai. And it was sort of like my idea to invite Nick to the seminar because, you know, I've been trying to find guests and people who can help deepen the conversation here and maybe problematize some of Ben's ideas, maybe get into a conversation with him about some of his points in the book Stacks. And the difficulty is always to find people who can actually have a productive conversation with Ben, because if you look at the list of scholars who are interested in similar issues, you don't find many who are very at ease with discussing the history and ontology of what we call high tech, and also at the same time are very well aware of sort of like the history of our geopolitics, and also to some degree philosophy of nature and how these two or three entities interact to shape our today's world. So the difficulty is always finding people who are good at all three and knows how to like bring them together. And this is what makes me very interested in Ben and interested in some of the guests that we brought to the class so far. Of course, another person I would have liked to bring to class would have been Matteo Pasquinelli, because he's also one of those exceptional scholars who deal with these issues, all three, and knows how they impact each other. So today we have Nick Land with us, and I'm not sure people who are sitting in Ben's class there, as far as the new center goes, our community members and our researchers and students know who Nick is, because Nick has been teaching seminars, particularly in issues dealing with artificial intelligence and technology and cybernetics for the last 2 years almost. He began his work with us with a seminar on Bitcoin and continued on to other topics. And you know, like working with Nick hasn't been very easy for us, because Nick happened to have a particular type of reputation in certain liberal and leftist circles as someone with problematic political ideas. He's a controversial figure when it comes to certain opinions of his. So the couple of things I wanted to say is that we've always been interested in the other side of Nick's research that has to do with the history of his involvement with CCRU, the Cybernetic Culture Unit at Warwick back in the 90s. And also his very recent work, which is in a continuum that deals with technology. And then there's this other stuff that Nick has gotten himself involved with, sort of like discursive risks that he's taken and other projects he's involved with, which we kind of like, we're curious about it, but we're not interested in including it in the curriculum of the new center. So, and Nick today is wearing the same hat that he usually wears in new center, which is he's here to discuss with us the ramifications of the stack, basically. So and it will be good if we can keep the conversation close to these topics rather than trying to like open up to other lines of inquiry. But as Ben was saying earlier in the discussion we had, we would not shut up any question or any kind of attempt to ask other types of questions. But it's good if we can stick to the two chapters that Ben suggested to Nick to read, which are the user and the cloud chapters of the book. So this is sort of like my intro, and I'm very glad to have facilitated this conversation between Nick and Ben, and I'm totally open to see what kind of result today's discussion will cause. So Ben, if you're happy, you can take over from me.
Okay, I'm happy. Yeah, thank you, Mohammed, for the introduction, and thanks to Nick for staying up late in China to join us for this and for this discussion. Nick's work has been a source of interest of mine for some time, and so it's I'm glad to have the chance to talk about this specifically about the issue research that I think we'll touch on today. I asked, in order to sort of give a little bit of efficiency to the time in which we'll be working and to sort of allow for that conversation to get some traction too soon, I had asked, suggested that we focus on two particular aspects of the stack book, the cloud layer and the cloud layer to come, and the user layer and the user layer to come as areas which sort of suggest that we have commonality in some of the research that drives us. The cloud layer chapter, as you know, as we've discussed, is dealing with the ways in which planetary scale computation has both deformed and distorted a traditional Westphalian geometry of geography, and what's in which global cloud platforms in particular allow for an political organization, economic organization, cultural organization that has a different spatial and territorial dynamic than the traditional state, and that in many ways, many of the geopolitical conundrums that may appear to a certain extent indecipherable or less clear in which we find ourselves may be made somewhat more mappable if we understand that the resolution of jurisdiction into a consensual horizontal plane of the cartographic map is multiplied, or in addition to this, we have a multiplication in addition of subsequent layers of this territory. That is, the logic of the cloud and the way in which it organizes geography and the logic of the state both coexist. It's not that one displaces the other. It's not a story of states and citadels virtualizing into networks, but rather in the grinding of these two layers together, unexpected and perhaps potentially quite interesting forms of sovereignty are emerging. And that is, as we discussed, just as on more and more of the traditional functions of the modern state, so too do states themselves evolve into cloud platforms. And so it's this dynamic that we're interested in. One of the things that we talk about in the cloud layer to come section has to do with questions of exactly the plasticity or porosity of those sovereign spaces. The questions of exit, entrance, and voice, which I discuss a little bit, I think is one of the areas that I think we'll probably have some discussion on there as well. And exactly, if the geography of origin is no longer the guarantor of membership in a particular polity, or at least what then is, and what are the terms and rights and responsibilities of this? These are some of the questions which we're opening up. As you know, refers to the condition by which the agent that would make use of this infrastructure is one that, as far as the system is concerned, as far as the stack is concerned, is open to anything, any agent that is capable of initiating animal, vegetable, or mineral. And so part of our interest in this is seeing this as a kind of a widening of the potential space of effective subjectivity that these infrastructure systems allow for, ones that confuse, if not, confuse and confound the traditional humanist notions of not only the specificity of species as a primary agent in this as well, but of shifts between individual and group agency, for example, and to a certain extent a dissolution of these into other kinds of infrastructural systems. And so some of the questions of, and as I guess as I see it, that these two layers may fold into one another, the kinds of questions that they ask fold into another in a specific way of, we have an emergent forms, not one, but several emergent forms of sovereign participation, sovereign last instance, sovereign identification, adjudication, so forth and so on, that are available to us and to other kinds of users in strange new ways, while at the same time there are new positions and subjectivities that are again available to us that are entered into the sovereign in different sorts of ways. And so this dynamic is in fact what we're trying to in fact make sense of. And in the book I identify this both as an analytic problem, one of mapping and understanding and deciding, and also one of us as a design problem, one that is in essence undecided, one that demands our attention and designation, and speculation in this as well. And so those are the two areas in which I think we might just get started. And so with that, I'll just turn it over to ask Nick to respond and to make some initial comments that we might get going from there.
Okay, thank you. As Ben was saying earlier, that there's a lot I think that we probably agree on analytically. And my prediction is that we probably will tend to drift away from those areas because friction is sort of self-stimulating, and so maybe other people will want to pull us back to these zones of consensus more than we will naturally do ourselves. I think that Ben's book is really a fantastic piece of work. I mean, I just want to start off saying that it's absolutely fascinating. And there are maybe some general things before moving into what I think will be more controversial areas. I could ask questions that are a little bit sort of more neutral. And one of the ones reading it that sort of pressed on me was to ask, is there some strategic reason why this isn't described as a strata analysis? Because, you know, my overwhelming sense of reading the sort of analytical structure of the book is that this is a just majestic strata analysis of the contemporary technosphere. And, you know, that stratic language sort of obviously inherited from the Deleuze and Guattari material seems to constantly resonate in it incredibly strongly. And so that's one initial question that I have, whether is there some substantive conceptual problem that leads to a distancing there, or is it just that it didn't seem helpful, or is what's the motive for the sort of the distance there?
Nick, if I can interject, would it be okay for you to describe why do you use the word strata and what differences you see between like a stack analysis and a strata analysis, that then kind of give a background to the people in the room and also in classroom with Ben, that can kind of like catch up with the response that Ben will have with you, for you?
Well, the obvious reference to this is a section of the second volume of Deleuze and Guattari's Capitalism and Schizophrenia called the Geology of Morals, which is it's dedicated to analysis of strata. And strata, I think, can be described without any particular convolution as being stack tectonic system. So when Ben says, you know, there are 6 levels to the stack, my immediate sense was, oh look, this is we're now entering into, and the subsequent discussion confirmed that to me, a really fascinating strata analysis of the contemporary technosphere, where, you know, you have this set of layers. They have set procedures for the subsumption of material from lower levels, its reorganization, its consolidation, its transformation, and this systematic machine process that carries you up and down through these different layers in a way that is quasi-geological. And this is something that I think Ben sort of really actually makes a point of, you know, starting with the earth and showing how these layers build upon each other, how they have a kind of obvious physical substratum that fuels them, resources them, and a set of distinctive protocols that organizes the relationship between these different levels. So it seemed to me there was a big sort of theoretical concordance between the kind of analytical procedure that was happening there, and it was one that wasn't, I mean, there are mentions of Deleuze and Guattari through the book, but none of them seem to really sort of lock together this common analytical project.
Right. So thanks for that. I think that I would say I wouldn't disagree that it is a strata analysis in general. I think that it is, in that there's an attempt to understand verticality as a fundamental ordering procedure. And also, as you say, the kind of transmissions between layers as the neutralizing context between how each layer is able to perform in this regard. I suppose the primary and most important distinction between understanding this sort of strata analysis from a geological strata analysis would be one of permanence on the one hand and instrumentality on the other. A geologic metaphor for the strata analysis, that there's, as you move higher, we're moving closer to the present in time, and that in the instantiation of one layer onto another and into another, that this is a process of fixing the form increasingly. The more layers are introduced, the more fixed the form becomes, at least in a local space. The stack is not fixed, and this is really the key notion, is that it is a modular apparatus as an accidental megastructure. In terms of the number of layers, I think for me 7 probably would have been the ideal one, just because it would have allowed it to be the same as the old OSI network architecture layer. But there's nothing magic about the number 6. It could be, I would certainly invite people to subdivide layers and add new ones as they see fit. And this is sort of the point, is that the way in which the network architecture stacks like TCP and OSI were designed to operate was that we wouldn't know in near-term or short-term future what would be a better technology to solve the particular job, to do the job that a particular layer is being asked to do. And so there was a kind of abstraction from the thing that the technology needed to do from the physical profile of that machine itself. And that's why you could swap out twisted pair copper wire for fiber optic, but they're physically quite different, but they're asked to do the same thing, and introduce one into this as a component layer within this larger apparatus, and the whole thing continued to work. And you can do the same, and then over the last 20 years, pretty much everything that may have existed in that stack, that the TCP/IP stack in the early 80s, has been replaced by something else, and yet the functions remain. And it's this abstraction of the function from the technology that is what allows it to grow in this way. And so we've described it in the class a bit in terms of Theseus paradox of the boat that's replaced piece by piece and yet retains its own virtual form. And so I suppose the question to the theoretical point and the importance of this leads to an underlining of the book as a design brief, that in addition to the distinction of this as an identification of a condition, tension and analysis, that the condition is itself not only in principle available to reformation or innovation or invention, it's set up, it is in fact almost congenitally structured in such a way that it demands this. It's always in a process of its own replacement, whereas the geologic strata are, as they emerge, they become more fixed. And so it's both the temporality and the openness to displacement and replacement that is, I think, the important point here.
So I'll throw in another word.
Yeah.
I think this is actually something that's really big, but subtle and complex, and cuts across a lot of what you are up to in the book, and also opens some interesting avenues for controversy. And that's the word, you've just used it now again, obviously it's a really important term for you, accidental, as in obviously the main usage being this term accidental megastructure. And now correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but it's obviously something that you're taking as a general claim, but I think the core specific instance of that you refer to is the instantiation of the internet on a packet switching system rather than the telecom preferred circuit system. And that this was something that it was historically. Sorry, am I not coming through?
No, you had some packet loss while you were talking about packets.
Okay.
Only on the audio. Just audio scene.
Well, the audio probably is more important, I would have thought.
Yeah, so now you sound great. Now you sound fine.
Okay,
So
yes, I'm sorry if there's going to be some glitching. Yeah. No, but it's just, inevitable. Okay. So there's a certain sense where you're wanting to say that this basic platform of the key internet protocols is radically contingent in a way that we can sort of historically identify. And the counter position to that, it's not because it's not something that can be dismissed simply, or it's more that there is a kind of an alternative pole of gravity in this question, I think, which is to do with the fact that there seems to be predictable criteria for the sufficiency of networks or the adequacy of networks. And again, if I can sort of make a Deleuze and Guattari reference, which I think is kind of helpful, their rhizome essay is an abstract description of something that might be considered to be like an ideal network, an ideal in the sense that it's highly abstract, and you can compare any particular instantiation of a network to this model of what a rhizomic system would be like, and talk about the degree to which the adequacy with which the actual network has instantiated this abstract network machine. And so my sort of counter contention or whatever, or provocation on this is just to say that there is a predictable trend towards the instantiation of ever more adequate networks. And I say this partly coming out of this sort of Bitcoin work. That when people saw Bitcoin, they said, wow, this does a network better than anything we've seen before. And we can say why it does. It's if you're going to use Deleuze and Guattari language, it's more rhizomatic, but you don't have to use that language. You can go back to Kant and you can just say it's more critical. It eliminates transcendent metaphysical elements. It eliminates these trusted third parties, to use the Bitcoin language. It's flatter, So therefore, there's a kind of model of what a network. Let me put this in the most extreme sort of terminology. Say wants to be, and that there is a kind of therefore a historical momentum towards this kind of ever greater adequacy of flat network systems that we see in the internet, that we then see in Bitcoin, that we're progressively seeing in these unfolding of ever more distributed network systems. And so I'm just wondering whether you think that at least complicates a certain set of connotations that might follow the notion of accidental. That there's chance, there's obviously contingency in these things, but on the other hand, there's also a sense of sort of momentum and predictability. And I personally am highly confident that we're going to see what comes next is going to be a more adequate instantiation of the network than anything we've seen so far on grounds that have criteria, and that we can justify why we say this is a better network than the kind we've seen before. And there's huge historical drivers behind that.
Yeah, I think yes, I think now we're getting somewhere. The question of the qualitative claim of I think there's two ways in which I would cleave this question of better. One is the qualitative claim of better for what, and better for whom, and under what circumstances, and how might those decisions be decided, and where is the position of decision to make those decisions? Is it in the network itself? Is the network deciding its own optimization criteria on its own, or is the network, or is there another form of some form of abstraction or authority that is able to adjudicate and select certain pressures for the network to evolve in certain kinds of ways? And I think it's probably a bit of both. In terms of the accidental, and I think this goes quite to the question of the accidental, which you picked up on. The way I would distinguish this, the kind of megastructures that were in vogue in architecture in the 60s and 70s, from the kinds of megastructures that the stack might represent, has to do with the distinction. I think of it in terms of the distinction between the master plan on the one hand and the platform on the other. The master plan was a system in which you had a deliberate sequence of desirable outcomes, and would work backwards to instantiate a kind of fixed system that would guarantee those outcomes. And like all fixed systems and these kinds of mechanisms, they tend to be very fragile. Thus, Biosphere 2, the ants and cockroaches break in, and then everything breaks. The fragility of the master plan system. Platform systems, and I think the stack is a representative of a platform system. Not all platforms are stacks, but stacks are platforms. Are more like a lattice work in which a set of rules are instantiated, and a set of both an abstraction, but also in a real machinic technical sense. The knobs and gateways and switches are fixed in place. In the course and the interactions with the platform, an emergent order may be possible. Thus, Google, as we discussed, Google doesn't make the content of the internet. They simply make the content of the internet more rational and more valuable and more transparent, both for those who use it and those who would be used by it. Accident, in this regard, also has this connotation, that it is essentially an emergent process as opposed to one that exists in relationship to the master plan. Attempt to use this term of the emergence, the notion of emergence, both in terms of to sort of put this back adjacent to the question of emergency. And of course, there's this discussion of Carl Schmitt at the beginning of the book and his state of exception and the emergency. And to try to talk about this position of emergency, not only as the position of the exception from which there's a kind of evasion of the normal course of the law, but also of emergence, and to sort of try to fold these back together in a particular in a sort of way. So then on the question of optimization of this, which I think is sort of an interesting one. I do think that there probably are certain sorts of centripetal processes to platform systems in general. They tend to have power law dynamic economics. They tend to be winner-take-all economics. These tend to be sort of processes that are in a certain way should be built into the physics of networks at this scale, that seek a certain kind of optimization. They seek a certain sorts of optimization, topographic optimization, which has cultural and economic effects. It's uncertain, and it's precisely this uncertainty that's of interest to me, whether or not those self-seeking, phase-space searching optimization mechanisms of the net correspondent to optimization in these other realms, whether or not, under what circumstances would that constitute, would those kind of physics optimization constitute a kind of economic optimization or political optimization? When does it and when does it not? And I think this goes back to this question of of whether or not those processes of optimization, as you call it, are ones that are built into the network itself always and only, or do they also operate in relationship to another sort of another abstract layer of authority that could identify, design them, adjudicate them, steer them, pilot them, react to them in some kind of evolutionary dynamic that would cause them to optimize in other kinds of ways. If you understand that.
Yeah, no, this is getting into really juicy territory for sure, yeah.
Still is a role for these kinds of evaluations. And I think this is what I try to make with the cloud layers, is that by the type of the case studies of these 4 major cloud platforms, they all operate on the basic same kind of underlying logic of the network, but the logic of how they position a user, how they position themselves in relation to other kinds of things are so vastly different between Amazon and Facebook, to take 2 banal examples, one focusing on identity, one focusing on logistics. Still a lot of room for the politics of platforms to work itself out in a lot of strange ways. So yeah, back to you.
Yes. No, but this is, yeah, we're really getting into it for sure, because you're definitely anticipating the sort of direction of questioning that I have on this for sure. Yeah, sorry, Mo. Yeah.
I just wanted to add something too, and to me, the difference here. I mean, I'm still gonna go to your question, Nick, and I mean, I totally enjoyed Ben's response, but I'm obsessed with the answer I wanted to give you in that moment, but I just had to wait for Ben to finish. Is that what I think what Deleuze and Guattari are doing? I mean, I'm not going to talk about what Deleuze and Guattari are doing, because you know better what they're doing, and everybody knows what they're doing. But what Ben's doing, in my opinion, is not just giving us a better network theory, but actually maybe it's not even a better network theory. This is what we've got and what we will get as we build on this thing that we have. So it's not necessarily like a better network theory. It's just like a better observation as how these physical networks that pre-exist the cybernetic revolution are sort of like integrating into the post-cybernetic sort of like layers or networks, right? So, and then it comes with I mean, this integration comes with a lot of like bumps and problems and ways to overcome them, that Ben's book documents that. So it's not necessarily like ontological. It's just like, I don't know, it's a form of realism. So I don't know what you have to say about that, Ben.
Well, I can pass it to Nick to respond. Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I just missed this last thing. So you're just passing over, is that right, Ben? Sorry.
Correct. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'll just pick up on what you were saying, if that's okay, because I think that this, my own sort of sense of our conversations is hugely about what you were just talking about, and the question of the plausibility of politically guiding the direction of these platform processes. And there's all kinds of things tied up with that. And obviously starting with the things that you're saying yourself about, in a way, the invocation of a certain sort of ethico-political, a space of ethico-political agency that is in some sense outside these platforms, or not entirely subsumed into them, and has some kind of Archimedean leverage upon them. Is that a fair way of describing what you're saying there?
No, that makes it sound a little too much like Judith Butler. I think for my taste, I don't think I'm using political with a small p here, or Chantal Mouffe maybe. I'm using political with a small p here, and I have no allegiance to this term. I would be happy to call it a kind of designability. To what extent is there a form of abstraction that is possible to design and designate? To what extent can we search the space of possible platform directions may evolve in, and intervene deliberately in some kind of self-reflexive way to have selection pressures back upon them. Whether that is even recognizable as political, I'm less concerned with. Whether or not it's couched in a specifically ethical framework, I'm more for it, but I wouldn't make that a priority. And I don't think an Archimedean perspective is a precondition for those interventions.
Like, yeah, we'll if we can loop back, because just with the internet, sort of the degree to which the internet actualizes an ideal network, and I don't know whether we can sort of agree about that sort of regulative idea of a network, but I'm assuming it's one that does not have superordinate controlling nodes. So, you know, in the terms that you were saying earlier, it cannot.
Not one node for sure. Yeah, but not all nodes are the same size.
No.
Not all nodes do the same thing. There's an ecological diversity of these. That's all I meant to say.
Sure. And so if we obviously look, I'm going to go through an extremely banal history very, very quickly that everyone knows. But you know, the selective pressure on the internet is virtual military confrontation, isn't it? So that, I mean, there were not a bunch of sort of techno-libertarian characters saying, hey, let's build this system that is a flat, decentralized system that's in some sense resistant to top-down command control, that it's in some sense censor-proof, all of these kind of things that then get taken up as kind of crypto-anarchist themes. Instead, you just have the military saying, you know, if we have a whole bunch of our command control centers knocked out by a Soviet first strike, we need some kind of system that's still going to work. And so the selective pressure is completely, it is driven in a sense outside of any controlling political motivations. You know, there no doubt were people, we know there were people soon who were extremely happy about the way the internet went, but they were not the people who were in a position to make this thing happen. The people in a position to make this thing happen absolutely did not share those objectives, and instead were forced to optimize the network in a sense, in this decentralized sense, purely in order to make it robust, it couldn't be fragile. It had to be a robust system that was survivable in terms that there were not these privileged nodes that you'd lose a few of them, the whole system would collapse. So I guess what I'm trying to say about this is, like, this is not a design decision that is a kind of ethico-ideological option, is it? It's something that is a concession to reality that is being made by these, you know, particular social and political forces, and the fact that you get a network that, in terms purely of the immanent criteria of kind of the idealization of a network, are being optimized without any sort of political direction behind that. So you're wanting to, in a way, introduce a kind of, however that's been complicated, you're wanting to introduce a kind of space of ethical leverage, of design leverage, that is not part of that actual practical historical lineage. Is that right? I mean,
no, I think it is part of the. I think it is part of the lineage. In that, I mean, I don't at all. I mean, I think the Paul Edwards closed world sort of, you know, the internet are one thing, And certainly the kinds of Google and Amazon are built on the infrastructure that was designed for that other particular purpose. But like all technologies, something is designed for one thing and eventually gets used for something else, and it grows into this. And it's not a matter of deviating from an original inspiration, but rather of a sort of a continuing transformation. This is, I think, a general evolutionary process in of itself, and nothing so mysterious. And so the originalism of the original idea of the internet is probably less important in terms of understanding the net where it's going than the process of how it deviated from the original idea is in terms of understanding where it's going. The ethical political, I guess I still would push back against this term,
right.
For all of the reasons of its phenomenological resonances. I don't think really what I'm suggesting. I do think that the transposability and redesignability of the mechanism, I would submit, is built into the apparatus. As all stack systems are designed. We're literally designed by in series of of standards papers, such that the technologies that could perform the work of any layer not only could be replaced but would be replaced, and that the mechanism is set in motion for those replacements. And so, understanding what the possibilities of those displacements and replacements of operations at one layer may be, how they may optimize at one local level and then have reverberations that have consequences at meso levels and macro levels from there as well. Whether we want to call that political or whether we want to call that simply design or we call this strategy, I'm more agnostic about those processes. What I want to underscore is that as a megastructural apparatus, it is not rigid. It's in fact in a process of itself, in a process of self-replacement. And those processes of self-replacement is probably one of the physics of the apparatus that we want to pay attention to, that has its own momentum. It's in the process of it has its own momentum regardless of our ethical political intentions otherwise.
Right. No. I think we're not in any kind of disagreement on that point.
No.
Yeah.
And so we may want to cut to the discussion of the kinds of sovereignties that this might entail. I mean, we talked a little bit about the kinds of cloud sovereignty, some of the issues I talked about in the cloud layer to come. But yeah, however we want to.
Yes, we would definitely get to that for sure. Yes. I mean, if I can just quote. Now, I don't know whether there's something unfair about quoting a preface, whether that part of a text has some sort of special status that makes it somehow sort of intrinsically kind of extrinsic. But
what's the quote?
Well, let me just quote a couple of things where you say.
Oh, yeah, sure.
You say the stack model is global, but it is not immutable. Totally. To the contrary, it is intrinsically modular, and so this megastructure is also a platform and an interface, even for the redesign and replacement of the stack we have, with a stack we want, or perhaps with the stack we want the least. So there's a sort of hint of this design agency here. I think a strong hint, isn't there, of something that you have some kind of leverage on this destiny of the system. And then you say the stack model is a diagram that works only when it is put to use. Perhaps by drawing the whole, we stand a better chance of designing a better architecture of globalization. Now, there's a strong one. And then talk about our shared design project. Now, these quotes for me get to the heart of where I think if we're going to have a kind of sparky controversy around this stuff. And I was initially thinking that I would be trying to needle you on this, on which is my obsession really at the moment, is about collective personal pronouns and what's going on in there. And I think you have an absolutely fantastically fascinating set of collective personal pronouns, because they're scattered through the stack, in all kinds of ways. There are we's that I think I recognize from certain sort of political constituencies. There are we's that imply the possibility of a kind of global a consensual global agency. There are we's that come from the fact that you're writing English, and there's a whole, you know, the English, the Anglo versus Chinese. So there's all of these interestingly complex collective pronouns sort of, you know, interfering with each other and perhaps resonating in ways it's hard to totally pick up on. So, I mean, the mega question that I have about this really is, to what extent does your analysis of these platforms reflexively complicate your sense of these collective pronouns, and you know, to what extent are they absorbed into certain platforms? To what extent are they wanting to defend some notion of resistance or exteriority in relation to a particular set of platforms, or because clearly they're not just fully fully independent, are they? I mean, you know, the platforms are going to reprocess any articulation of collective subjectivity and agency.
That's right. No, I think the point well taken. I think that it's precisely I mean, this is, I think, what's at stake to a certain extent is the status of the composite agencies that may or may not be possible, and the possible languages or technologies with which those composites may or may not do whatsoever. I think part of what you're picking up on, and I don't really disagree, is to a certain extent the heterogeneity and certain messiness of those positions. The question of resistance and exteriority to these processes is probably less important for me than it would be for some others, particularly in some ways. Which is why I try to characterize this as in terms of questions of design and nation. I don't have, you know, I guess I would say that the process of commingling between these apparatuses that interpolate and produce strange forms of partial agencies, as the way in which those apparatuses abstract themselves. They produce positions that then act back upon the apparatus, on the one hand, and the ways in which those agencies produce apparatuses that are reflections or prostheses or residue of their own actions upon the world. I think that those kinds of procedures of technogenesis are as complex and fraught when dealing with systems as they are with dealing with much simpler technologies. I think probably one of the ways in which this will work itself out most violently in the future will be precisely around the issue of the punctured and perforated status of the we and the I that our political discourses have been predicated upon. And that's, to a certain extent, one of the key points I try to identify around the user layer, is that economic discourses that prioritize an unproblematic individual, political discourses that prioritize an unproblematic political collective, are probably are almost automatic casualties of these kinds of processes, and yet they're refortified self-image that is emerging and that will emerge in response to those challenges of their centrality, are ones that in and of themselves will have reverberating effects on precisely these kinds of processes. And so it's in you would be correct to identify in the sense that the position of agency and subjectivity is to a certain extent plural and slippery and just in some ways unrecognizable within the way in which it's set up in here, and would be correct to recognize that it's precisely the status of the subjectivity, individual, plural, political, economic, that's at stake, and that it is, to a certain extent, the reactionary impulse to refortify those positions that is, to a certain extent, something that will characterize the cultural backlash to these kinds of processes going forward. I think it's if it's not clear in how I underscore that in the user layer to come, that's certainly something that I meant to identify. I hope that's clear.
Well, by the nature of the thing, clarity is
well, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Polite way of saying I'm stopping now.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of, we could perhaps be looking forward to the point where we're going to totally open this up. I don't know what you think about that. I was wanting to, if I'm not drifting off our sort of core agenda,
no, go
I
ahead.
really wanted to sort of get you to rehearse some of your discussion, especially for me as the nucleus of this, because it's an argument that I find particularly fascinating, is Balaji Srinivasan's work, and particularly the text that you quote, his online address, Ultimate Exit, and the whole question about voice and exit. You want, and I think crucially, because I say crucially because I think that this is inevitably what happens with this debate. This is a destiny for us, that it has to go in this direction. That the notion of entrance also gets brought into it, and these seem to me the overwhelmingly the most crucial sort of. I'll put lots of inverted commas around politics for your sake and my sake, but the absolutely most critical political issues of our time is orbiting these questions. And I mean, I'm very sympathetic to Balaji Srinivasan's argument, much more than you, for sure. And
well, I'm half sympathetic to it. I would defend, I would defend it from its detractors and would detract it from its defenders.
Right.
But maybe
well,
very
hopefully
quickly,
we'll get both. Yeah.
If you could very quickly rehearse Hirschman's exit voice thesis, just so we know what we're talking about, maybe in a minute.
Yeah. Yes, for sure. Because as you say in the book, this is where it comes from. Albert O. Hirschman's. Now, his third term, the book is Exit, Voice, and Loyalty.
Yeah.
And now I think there's an interesting kind of symmetry here. And I think whatever our frictions and disagreements on this are going to be, in a certain sense, we're clustered in the middle of the way this unfolds. Because I think to the left, entrance is the crucial term that is brought to bear on this from outside, and on the right, loyalty, which gets missed often in this, is the term that they would invoke in it as a kind of a point of leverage on this discussion, and loyalty sort of gets lost sometimes in this. And Hirschman's book, I'm going to immediately now simplify it a little bit. Maybe
of course
we can come back and recomplicate it, but he says the exit voice distinction is of extreme generality for understanding things far wider than a narrow sense of the political sphere, because the distinction between the political and the commercial sphere is to a large extent can be articulated in terms of the contrast between voice and exit. That what typifies commercial relations is the absolute predominance of exit. So that when you're going shopping, it's taken absolutely for granted that you can walk away. That's what it is to be in a commercial relationship with somebody. You know, if and a shop is based upon the fact that its customers have an absolute exit right. So obviously we could go into complicated questions about monopolistic and oligopolistic complications of commercial or consumer exit rights, but that's probably going.
Yeah, and whether labor has a right of exit as well. And positive and negative
yes, for sure. I mean, labor within the terms of its liberal conception has a perfect exit, right? And of course, you know, there's the Marxist rejoinder that, you know, it's all it has to look forward to is to be skinned if it enters into this kind of a liberal relationship. Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to nutshell this as much as possible. So I think that basically there is a hard definition of liberalism that is based upon an absolute priority of exit. And I think there is a sort of fairly convincing notion of what a very generalized sense of the left is, that is orchestrated around the notion of voice. And it's the relative priority of the political versus the commercial, and whether voice systems are being subsumed into exit-based systems, or exit systems are being subjected to processes of political voice. And Hirschman, I think, very persuasively says this is an extremely flexible, powerful, and insightful kind of schema for understanding the basic ideological and socio-political controversies that have bedeviled modernity or whatever. And so obviously when we now get to Balaji Srinivasan, and I think he's part of an extremely important cultural wave. It's small, it's by no means a sort of majoritarian thing, anything close to it. And precisely because of that, it is so intense about its commitment to this notion, which is the absolute prioritization of exit over voice. And so he says that the only response to political oppression that is going to be supported from his point of view is walk away. And that technology is basically facilitating this possibility of walking away from a whole series of different constrictive relationships. It's tied up in a certain sense with an understanding of globalization. You know, I mean, Srinivasan's obviously an interesting figure. You know, sort of there's an ethnic Silicon Valley American techno-capitalist positioning that he's in that is absolutely fascinating. But he brings that all together. And
he has this, and it's positioned as a strong argument, particularly of a left coast, East Coast, you know, versus Washington and New York, California versus the East Coast kind of dynamic. And it's also, there's an exit, but I think he's using this. I mean, I think he also is making the case that ultimately that this is possible because of that the left coast has entrance that there's been a replacement and displacement of economic and cultural infrastructural systems by networks that work better, in your term, and therefore entrance is possible, and therefore exit is generalizable. But without the entrance into those platforms, at least even in his model, exit is exit into nowhere.
I think the question of entrance is really interesting. I mean, you say, if I can quote you again, let me find you this, where you say, when exit becomes a privilege, one defined by the suppression of entrance, it stops being a philosophical principle and starts being a weapon. And I think that well captures the ideological intensity of this stuff. I mean, I think it's super intense, and you know, it's going to produce.
Because the principle of exit requires some corresponding capacity for entrance. Otherwise, it's not a freedom. Otherwise, it's not exit. It's abandonment.
I think there is one sense it is abandonment, at an extreme. That's
and
definitely for sure.
And also I think where I would go with this, part of the principle that I would argue for the entrance and exit here is also not just that is not really necessary. I mean, I think that there's an ethical, just general, Rawlsian arguments to be made about, you would prefer not knowing which side of the wall you're born on. But really just that in terms of the networks that work better, networks that are dynamic and that are able to absorb and make use of foreign material are ones that are more resilient, that have a capacity for dynamism, that are more evolutionarily robust, that have greater internal diversity, and so forth and so on. On page 319, I talk about this in terms of the specifications, which John Postel, who wrote called the robustness principle, which boils down to be conservative in what you send and liberal in what you accept from others. And this is the model for the network, that you don't want networks that are closed. You don't want a situation where you can't receive information from other networks. You want one in which you're able to have a certain promiscuity of internalization of diverse material in order for the system to succeed. And so when you have systems in which, when you have systems that are self-encapsulated based on arbitrary moments of division, where the music stops and whoever happens to be inside the wall at that particular moment in the dome city gets based on, hereditary succession inside the dome, in the long run, you have fragile ecologies. That's the problem.
Yes,
now,
I think the other side to that, though, is I think to do with what is meant by I mean, obviously, I think Balaji Srinivasan, he's a Bitcoin guy. He's an internet guy. He's not interested in censorship, in terms of like controlling access to a network in that way. Anyone can buy into the Bitcoin network. It's totally non-exclusive, absolutely inclusive. Sorry, just have to say one thing.
Go ahead. I'm sympathetic to all of those things. I don't think my position in what he's. I think there's an eventual complementarity to our positions for his and my position.
But I think the crucial point, I think, is this on this question, is the fact that the protocol is protected against transformation by the discretion of entrance into the system. So it's so
the protocol
you can't buy your way into Bitcoin. There's the 51% attack thing, but the whole system is designed from the fact that using Bitcoin does not mean you get the right to rewrite the Bitcoin protocol. Entrance into these internet systems doesn't mean you get the right to rewrite the protocol. So it's about this. It's tied up with the notion, the ideal of algorithmic government, in the sense of system protocols that are immunized against transformation by entrance, obviously in the role, as far as these networks are concerned, as aggressive intruders, if their role is to enter the system in order to rewrite the system. So I think this is what Balaji Srinivasan's exit notion is about, is the fact that the exit system is wanting to immunize itself against having its protocol subject to some kind of universal veto or constraint through sort of majoritarian opinion. If a set of norms should be able to isolate itself in order to establish a kind of a robust protocol that doesn't require some kind of generalized consensus in order to persist or or arise in the first
decision.
place.
I get. So the way I would I draw this distinction, I follow your point. The way I draw this distinction in the book is a distinction between, and I think I think that there's a difference between protocol and interface within this. So the way in which I describe the functioning of platforms in general is ways that I think are quite similar to what you described, in that there is a fixed and to a certain extent arbitrary protocol that determines whether or not someone or something is able to make use of and to enter into this platform according to these predetermined rules. And so Bitcoin, for example, there's certain protocols that require the capacity to do transactions, the way in which currency is unitized, and so forth and so on. Same with TCP/IP or OSI. TCP is actually a pretty shitty handshaking protocol for 21st century, but good luck if you wanted to replace it with something else. As opposed to, let's say, the old CompuServe and AOL era, had different fiefdoms that had their own protocols. What you see with this universalization of the protocols is the capacity for interoperability between users or agents within a network that previously may have been interoperable. And so what you get from the standardization, the fixed, arbitrary, non-majoritarian standardization of the protocol, is actually greater universality. And even to a point where in which you have ability to enter into and make use of the network that would go beyond certain kinds of agency. And I think that, again, this is one of the sort of crises of the, one of the things that'll be interesting about the post-humanist aspects of the user layer down the road. The interface, and so I think to your point, is the standardization of the interface actually opens for more towards universal suffrage than towards fiefdoms. I think it depends
what you mean by suffrage, though. I mean, to me, suffrage means you get a vote on the program. And that's precisely what you don't have, isn't it? I mean, suffrage. It seems to me suffrage, universal suffrage elimination, because the notion that by participating in the system you have a voice on the structure of the system is what is completely eliminated.
No, not on the structure of the system necessarily, but on the participation within as an agent within the platform itself. For example, as far as I have it, as far as the stack is concerned, a person can be a user, a sensor can be a user, a trading algorithm can be a user, a driverless car can be a user. It doesn't care who or what you are. You do not require further political credentialization in order to participate and act. As long as you abide by this protocol, you can be from Mars. You don't even have to be a carbon-based life form.
Yeah, sure, sure. We are absolutely, totally in agreement on this point. But I would only say that the reason that radical openness is possible is because the protocol itself is radically immunized against processes of political voice within the protocol. And by processes of political voice, I mean those that would actually be germane to some process of revision of the.
And I don't disagree with that. I would just I would actually, at the point of this, we would generalize and even abstract this further, and just say that this is a function of infrastructural systems more generally. The reason why plumbing or electrical systems or road systems or the metric system or the 24-hour time zone system is able to function as a form of automation, as an automation of provision, is because it doesn't require any, and is actively resistant to incremental decision on a point-by-point basis. It resists voice, and because it has, in a sense, automated those decisions in advance. And so I don't know that I'm suggesting that I'm going even a step further, saying that's not even just a principle of these kinds of networks. It's a principle of infrastructure more generally.
Right. No, yeah. So obviously I'm totally in agreement with you about that. I'd be interested, though, when that is extended into the more conventionally conceived political domain, it becomes an extraordinarily controversial point, obviously, because our Rousseauistic inheritance is precisely what we mean by political voice, is the fundamental revisability of, without exception, of even the core principles of the social order, and that's actually what democracy in its contemporary meaning amounts to, that it's simply the notion that there is any right protected layer, a sort of hard constitutional layer to the social order is an intrinsically kind of counter-democratic position to maintain.
A democratic in a sense of way. Yes, yeah, and this is also, this is a point I make in the discussion of platforms more generally, is that there's perhaps part of the politics of platforms that I think is confusing, and I think it's confusing for both the left and the right, is that there's, to a certain extent, in many cases, not only a non-direct correspondence between means and ends, but even an asymmetry between them. And Alex called prefigurative politics in the Inventing the Future book. A non-hierarchical, democratic, egalitarian, open system that you, by definition, need a non-hierarchical, democratic, open community of means in order to produce that outcome. And that when it fails in doing so, the initial response obviously is to police the means, to purify the community, and to try to identify how it is that you can refix means and ends more closely. Democratic outcome requires democratic means. It's an axiomatic presumption. It just happens to be wrong, in terms of infrastructural and platform politics. What we see is that in many cases that just think of the urban street grid as the classical platform. In many cases, it's the imposition of an inflexible, autocratic, rigid, non-negotiable mechanism that produces the most democratic, non-hierarchical, idiosyncratic, diverse, urban form, sort of urban outcome possible. And so it's not only that doesn't require a direct correspondence with needs and ends. In many cases, platforms operate on the inversion of those. That you have that and this is one. So if this is if this is our point, I think I'm agreeing. I would agree on this. That we may be coming at it from different angles. I'd also say that you notice in the section I'm not really talking about voice so much. There's a discussion of this, but what I'm trying to add to this, the addition of entrance to this dynamic, I mean in terms of this, in terms of an argument about how it is that the evolution of the networks might in fact perform better, what their optimization would actually work. They require entrance because they work better when there are those possibilities of entrance. Voice and the negotiation of the protocols that would structure those networks on a continuous ad hoc basis is a completely different thing. I think where we have an agreement is that the logic is one that is resistant to those constant incremental negotiations.
Yeah. No, I think I'm in total agreement with what you're saying there. Yeah, for sure. But I'm interested, or even wonder really whether, if pressed, your argument with Balaji Srinivasan would dissolve to a far greater extent than you're perhaps imagining it would, because
no, I think it would. Like I say, I think that a point. I don't think he takes it far enough. I guess is sort of the implication, and I don't think that the disagreement that I we won't even say there's a disagreement, would rather that I think that by amplifying some of the implications of what he's doing, what he's proposing, taking it out of, I think abstracting it from a particular kind of libertarian culture that reifies the agency of the individual, in ways that are probably conservative, probably just unnecessary and reactionary. And I think extending it further in some of the directions of the kinds of the affordances of particular infrastructural apparatuses to have particular effects, some of the things that we're talking about, I think that there would be probably points of significant convergence. Wouldn't suggest at all, yeah. I mean, I spent a lot of time, you know, I'm not an anti-Silicon Valley person. I don't have this, I've spent a lot of time there and worked there. I don't have Silicon Valley doesn't represent the Death Star or some kind of nexus of trouble for me. I'm a Californian, so I don't really see this as these arguments as a problem in and of themselves. I should say I find them to be. I get tired when I get frustrated when they really stop short of their own implications and get stuck on what I find to be certain kinds of lazy maneuvers. And I think a lot of the problem of technology is understanding that platform systems have a logic of their own that is not reducible to neither markets or states. It's not any of those things in and of itself. I think the problems generally have to do with the problems are elsewhere, which I've described at some length. So I'm waiting for us to disagree about something. I'm a little bit surprised we've managed to get through.
Yeah, no, I'm sort of surprised, actually. This has been more harmonious than could have been reasonably expected. What do you think, actually, Ben? Do you think we should open it up now? Like, we've been going, an hour and a half? Do you think we should see whether...
Yeah, I think other people will probably have a better opportunity to find something for us to disagree about than we may at this point. So, Mohammed, do you want to step in and provoke us into fisticuffs in some way? Anyone?
Mo, you're on mute right now.
The problem with me is that I'm using my phone because the place I'm staying in Vienna does not really have good data, and if I tether to my laptop, I would use all my data plan in like 1 second, and then on the phone I cannot really see whose turn it is. So I think for that we can rely on theater. But what I was gonna say is that, like, I mean, my little interjection was left without a response, which is fine. But I felt like Nick just agreed to what I said through what he followed it up with. Maybe not immediately, but he kind of agreed to, and then he tried to find places in your text in which you sort of like provide some sort of clue in terms of where our agency lies, in terms of adding more layers or changing it simply even by saying what kind of stacks we don't want and what kind we want. So I think, Nick, you agreed with me, even though you didn't want to take up my challenge.
No, I thought you were aiming that at Ben, actually, Mo. So sorry, I didn't think it fell upon me.
Nick, Mr. Nick Land, you agreed with me. I think Ben just said, "Oh, I pass it on to Nick," and then you were eager to respond to what Ben said, but then later on you kind of like agreed with me in a way that, like, yeah, like Ben's description is, you even use the word real or realism even. So just wanted to like put that little note there. And then for moderating the actual discussion, I would think Theodore would be a better person to go over the names on the list and kind of like see who wants to speak next. And I'm here and I'm listening and I'm enjoying this, and I interject if I have to.
Okay.
Okay, and then I'll ask field questions from this room, and they can.
Yeah, exactly. Just please, if anyone who wants to talk, please add your name to the chat box on the side, and then anyone from your class, Ben, if they have a question, maybe they should step to your laptop or something, right? Because I don't know how you're going to take questions from your class meaningfully, so we can hear them too.
Sure. Or Ben.
I'll have them. Yeah.
if you want to just repeat the question, that would be fine too.
But yeah, and Theodore, could you please turn your camera on? Here we go. Thank you.
Great. So if anybody else in the New Center class has a question, they can, yeah, just put your name in the sidebar and then we'll go in order from there. Or if someone in Ben's class has a question first, that we can go that way.
Wendy had a question about the flat. We were talking about the address layer a little bit in this class and some of our reading of this as well. And we discussed in New Center last week. I don't know that if Nick had a chance to look at this chapter or not, but maybe this speaks a little bit to what Mo was getting at around the realism in a certain way, or the this as well, and whether or not this is a. I guess the gist of your question is that here's a network that is functionally, so in a certain way, actually systematic. I mean, it's a way in which there is maybe a correspondence of flatness of means and flatness of ends within address layers that may operate in this way. I suppose there's also a question of scarcity of addresses. One of the interesting things around, I think, another way in which a conversation may have gone is around issues of scarcity and post-scarcity addresses. And the way in which I deal with, the way in which I sort of working around addresses is dealing with IPv6 is this 128-bit string, works out to roughly 10 to the 23 addresses per person, which introduces a kind of post-scarcity of addressable ontology, of functional network ontologies, where you can have almost total descriptions of a network space, not just one of them, but billions of them. Each person could have 10 to the 23 addresses. So imagine a map with 10 to the 23 addresses on it that's 7 billion layers thick, one for each person. This is sort of the thought experiment that drives this kind of question. This represents each of these is equally realistic, equally correspondent, has its own relationship to what we talked about in terms of the geoscapes and the sort of the logic of a symbolic imaginary that would organize certain kinds of figure-ground relationships and what's here. And I talk about this also in terms of some of the implications for deep addressability as the basis of network economics to come that would allow for forms of real information exchange at scales that would be otherwise unfamiliar to us. Just to recapitulate this point. In terms of the flatness, I think is certainly of interest to, as Randy, where these systems are ones in which are systematically flat, and then also have also relatively non-hierarchical as well. And maybe this is a kind of corresponding to this. There's usually great comments from the New Center people. So yeah, please, Philip, maybe.
Sean, do you want to come in?
Sure. I like the sort of development of the address space, and it sort of shifts the focus from just defining individual objects to instead the relation of objects. I think that's definitely a good direction, and especially since you form it on the basis of exponentiation, to sort of give some sense of the change of shape. But I would say all these sort of like discrete, even if we have more addresses, there are far more things and purposefully more things than we could sort of enumerate. So there's different kinds of infinities, and there's really important things that are countably infinite. For instance, even when it comes to this idea that you could put something as simple as a video or a manuscript on the internet, and that has an address, right? But there's sort of no bounds on the amount of manipulations we can perform on that original piece and produce more pieces. So this very quickly creates this sort of uncountable infinity. So I'd wonder what you believe the shape of the address space's growth would be when we start caring about unbounded infinities.
Well, I would say that any address, I mean, there's an appearance of infinity. There's this, and I think you get to this, there's a sense to which that there's more potential addresses than really maybe functionally necessary to organize a scene and to map cause and effects relationships in a practical way. And so there may be an effect of infinity, perceptual, an illusion of infinity, if I'm getting interested. Any address space is delimited by a finite number. You know, zip code is in the US is 10,000 possible addresses, and IPv6 is 128 bit. And so there isn't any sort of real infinity. I think at the level of the kind of social and economic effects of and cultural effects of the multiplication of addressing in this way, it goes back to some of the things that Genevieve and I were talking about last week in terms of geoscapes and the kinds of consolidations of certain logics of organizing the linguistic at their basis, things into what is addressed and not addressed, which things are subdivided into multiple addresses, and which things are not even addressed at all. Those are not decisions that are reducible to the physical appearance of those things. They're not reducible to the molecular complexity of those things, but are linguistic operations at their basis. I see the development and organization, consolidation, division, subdivision, bifurcation of those addressing regimes in ways that would probably be similar to linguistic evolution, and having their own ability to enforce themselves and to develop their own kinds of vernaculars and imagined communities in relationship to them. I think it's also important to note that when we're talking about addresses, we're talking about this is also a condition of subjectivity. This is something that has an address to speak and be spoken to use the sort of vocalic prejudice, but it's something that can send or receive information. It can write or be written, if you like. And this is also something that isn't is something that is available to matter and substance in the world directly. And so part of the interest as well is how it is that real things may communicate with real things across natural scales, both above and below the scales that we would normally take to be a natural thing. 10 to the negative 4 meters to communicating with 10 to the 4 meters, and so forth and so on. How those things that we may call a language, or those convergences of semantics and vernaculars of identification and counter-identification and information exchange and syntax over time would be ones that are exclusive to human culture, and certainly I think not something we need to wait for. I think it's just an understanding of certain kinds of processes that are probably already at work.
Is that answer?
And Nick, I know you read a lot of this stuff is in the address layer if you're interested in following up on what these tangents.
Sean, if you'd like to respond, or if Nick, you want to respond to that too, that'd be fine.
Yeah, I would like to hear also from Nick, but I have a quick response afterwards.
Well, my response might be at a bit of an oblique, actually, which would be on the whole question of scarcity, which is a big thing. We'd open a sort of door. Maybe we want to open that door. I don't know. But I was going to actually ask Ben before, and it maybe is relevant to your question. I don't know whether you would think that, Sean, about whether you guys know the Urbit. I think it's just a massive beta at the moment, but it's very, very tied up with this notion. It's basically, it describes itself as a Bitcoin for real estate, virtual real estate. And obviously, scarcity becomes a kind of positive feature, just as it is with Bitcoin. I mean, the fact that there's only ever going to be 21 million Bitcoins is the whole basis of why Bitcoins are going to have whatever value they end up with. And this is being generalized. It's called virtual real estate, but I think almost more directly, helpfully, is reputation space. So the very fact that there's only a certain amount of virtual Urbit space going to exist you put your address in that space. You know, it can be subdivided to a certain extent. You can, it's fungible to a certain extent. You can sell it, but the point is, if you know, if you make a garbage heap out of this piece of real estate, it's not just one of a kind of infinite amount of pieces of virtual space, like at the moment, social media addresses. You know, you can just grab it off the shelf within minutes, turn it into a sewer and leave, you know? And so the notion of the Urbit thing is like, if you don't have infinite virtual space, you will take more care of the thing. You know, you will have the process of reputation, will be able to actually have some kind of economic logic to it. This has value. I don't want to mess it up. If I wreck it, it has some kind of cost attached to it. And so I guess the point I'm only making this is the scarcity question, I think, is, to use Ben's favorite word, reversible. You know, I mean, it's like everyone treats this abundance thing as if it's just like an obvious utopian great thing to happen, but abundance is spam, abundance is pollution, but you know, abundance is a lot of bad stuff too, and scarcity is reciprocally something to be treasured and used, and you know, it tends to be massively rhetorically undervalued.
It's it's deflationary.
Yes,
which is I suppose it's its virtue, as you would put. Yeah, it's precisely its deflationary part.
I would say yes, that'd be very convenient if there was sort of this constricting force, as if things were constantly getting smaller, almost to possibly fit in somewhere to the Earth layer, like as the higher levels sort of like expand and things get more complicated, eventually you run out of resources to power these things. And I agree that there's a lot to suggest that things are going this way, but I think that won't always necessarily be the case. I believe that the proliferation of things that we will create will inevitably break this sort of link with the Earth layer. And I was wondering how the other layers would respond to that disconnection.
If I could just, I think what we're, just to sort of circle the conversation back, what we were talking, there was an earlier thread in our discussion that had to do with the reference point of for example, Sean may be referring to something else, but the reference point of Bitcoins and blockchains, that the ultimate reference for the production of new Bitcoins and the calculation of them is not only the mathematics and the algorithmic sophistication, it's also the energy to power those calculations. And so another thing arguably to recommend blockchain-based currency is that its ultimate reference is energy. And that an energy-based currency as a way of monitoring and modeling the scarcity of the substrate itself has value in that it incentivizes resource care in ways in which currencies that are based on sort of a sort of infinite supply do not. And so I think largely there's just also the question of the expansion of the apparatus as something that's not that is itself reliant upon other economies that are geologic economies and biochemical economies that are scarce in and of themselves. And so regardless of whether they're modeled to be scarce or not, they are made by this fact.
Great. Sean, do you have anything else you'd like to say? Otherwise, we can pass off the mic to Philip now.
No, I think that was really great. Thank you.
Cool. Philip, you can go, unless someone else in Ben's class wants to go, and maybe we can do like a back and forth. Ben, would someone like? No.
You guys get first dibs on all this, so just raise your hand or anything you want to at any point, so just jump in. You want to talk? Go ahead. Yeah. We have a question in my class, if that's okay. We can hold up, Philip, 1 sec.
Great.
Go ahead. Yes, he says it. Yeah. So the question is back to this question of how platforms may begin in a sort of authoritarian or autocratic imposition and may have these democratic outcomes and effects.
Yeah, I guess how, if at all, that translates back into rising authoritarian movements, like older models.
And then how this connects back to a kind of, I'll put it, I'm just going to paraphrase and so tell me if I get it wrong, how that would tie into a more sort of global cultural surge in authoritarian politics that may be tied, both in the US and abroad, that may be tied to, and the question, is that tied to this kinds of the predominance of platforms as a system, or is it tied to other kinds of ethno-nationalistic impulses? Are they in conflict with one another? Are they correspondent to one another? Right. And is the use of platforms contributing to this authoritarian as a technique in and of itself? Yeah, okay. So this is what I figured we'd probably be talking a lot about today anyway. So that's, I'm going to ask Nick to, if you could follow my slow rephrasing of the question, if you wanted to go to this. I figured also, just to remind everyone, it's election day here in the US, and so we have...
yes, it's a heated issue at the moment, obviously for you guys.
It is, apparently, yes. I've read, there's a thing in the paper about it.
I mean, look, I'd only say about this that I think it's like, if you have an authoritative voice-based political apparatus, people will try and grab that apparatus. And, you know, I mean, so it seems to me, if people have left this giant tub of honey on the lawn and they're surprised that bears have turned up to eat it. I mean, so this is, for me, this question comes back to the thing I was quoting from Ben earlier about yeah, sorry, 1 second.
It's okay. I realize it's 3 o'clock in the morning where you are. So
Yeah. I just
you're in the future.
Yeah. Sorry, if I don't find it in 1 second, I will start. Yeah, no, this quote, yes, was talking about a political and cultural momentum towards generalized secession, not one worldism, seems to drive what we might see as the nomos of the cloud. So that seems to me, from the other side, to be cutting right into this question. It's like, you know, if you have large, concentrated, voice-based structures of authority, people are going to try and grab those things, you know. And so my sense of this is that maybe platforms bring that to a crisis, but they also provide the opportunity to try and disintegrate those structures so that you simply do not have those kind of prizes lying around, and you allow people space to make their own screw-ups without dragging everybody else into it, if that's what they're inclined to do. So that would be my basic take on this thing.
Could I ask you to paraphrase and repeat that, because the voice cut out a little bit on our end here. It gets to sort of so if you could just quickly repeat it again. Just, we have a packet loss.
Yeah, just to say, I think
Voice is failing.
am I still inaudible at this point? Am I clear now?
I can hear you clearly. It might be on.
I couldn't hear
Yeah.
you. So,
Well,
right.
I do think it's right that these networks bring this. They bring the problem of political voice to a crisis, and that the result of that, which even after our sort of harmonious loving, I still think that Ben is more suspicious of this than me, where Ben says a political and cultural momentum towards generalized secession, not one worldism, seems to drive what we might see as the nomos of the cloud. And I mean, I think deglobalization in the general sense, not just of the globe, but of all highly integrated voice-based political systems, is something that I see as being internet-driven to a massive extent. And on this, actually, one point of big agreement that we've not talked about is the whole relation to the emergence of the Westphalian political order. Because I think this is totally right. I think on several ways, I think it's right because it's the right scale to be thinking about this. I think we're at a point of radical historical inflection that deserves, absolutely merits comparison with the beginning of the modern political order in the 16th and 17th century. I mean, that's the level. We're talking about Gutenberg and the internet, and I think anything that doesn't see things on that scale is just missing quite how radical the times that we're living in are. And I further agree with Ben about the fact that this just is about a total reshaping of fundamental geopolitical conceptions, and just the relationship between the printing press and the origin of the modern state, which was extremely intimate. And I think we have the same kind of thing today about our contemporary information and communication systems and these very, very basic structures of political order. And so the big danger to me is to look at these things at too low a level and just worry about a few obnoxious politicians as if that's the kind of scale we're talking about. We're talking about a restructuring of the world. I hope it's not going to be as messy as the last restructuring of the world, because like a third of the German population died in the 30 Years' War. I mean, we didn't get to the Westphalian order through a nice, neat, polite social arrangement. I mean, the thing was catastrophized into being by the complete collapse of the previous set of
really, is it us? Is anyone out there?
Yeah, I think you're going in and out a bit. Can you hear me right now?
Who are you talking to?
Now I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe if you want to lower your bandwidth, you could do that, and that might help. Otherwise, do you want to respond to that?
Okay.
I can hear you. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Sorry, who are you talking to now, Theodore?
Sorry.
To Ben.
Right, yeah.
One sec. I guess we're just going to wait until he can hear us.
Actually, I've lost Ben completely now. He's not even on the row of... Oh, yeah, back. Okay.
Okay, good. We got to switch. Okay. So I'll just add to this one thing as well on the question of the. I don't think they're necessarily connected in this sort of direct in this sort of way. I think that I think what you're seeing. I think particularly the way in which ethno-nationalism has become a kind of. I mean, at that level of at the symptomatic level, as the particular quality of the voice that it becomes kind histrionic. So things is quite clear against this the realization that and of the Westphalian order in particular sorts of ways, and a response in the guarantees of citizenship that that order in principle provided for, in which people's lives may be more or less lived in relationship to
Ben, can you hear me?
I'm still doing this thing.
I'm sending him a message to ask him to lower its bandwidth, I think.
Are not guaranteed citizenship, available to people which ethnicity is used as part of the language of that fabrication. I think to be it seems to be a kind of logically automatic symptomatic response. It doesn't make it any less idiotic, but it would, in a certain sense, sort of make sense. It's like this was this space of guarantee that may have existed fantastically in some imaginary kind of way, right? I mean, in the United States, the production and fabrication of whiteness and the production of citizen and who gets to be citizen in the United States are the same history. The history of the fabrication of whiteness and the fabrication of citizenship is the same history. And so as the status of citizenship becomes more unstable, by response, the consolidation around that particular racial identity is symptomatic in some way. And I think that's the same as in France and in Hungary and in everywhere else. Yes, but that was
Ben, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, can you
hear me?
Yeah, it's sort of choppy though. Can you lower your bandwidth up at the top bar here? There's the little like ascending triangle. Just put it to low.
The little ascending triangle.
It's like the ascending bars.
Where am I?
At the top of the Google video, there's like a mic icon, a video icon, then the ascending bars, and a gear, and a hanging up phone.
Yeah, got it.
Great.
So
That's better. That'll focus on your audio.
I'm on low, so then it is well.
Okay.
Okay, so let me just repeat. Did you hear my last thing I said, or should I repeat it?
I heard it. I don't know whether
Yeah, I think
everyone else
we heard it. It was just a little choppy, so that was
Okay, all right. Okay, that's good. Yeah.
we have a question from Philip here too. Whenever you're ready.
Oh, no, and we had Philip on hold too here, right? So we were gonna.
Yeah. So I'll put him up now. You're up, Philip.
Okay. I found a passage between Ben and Nick very interesting in the beginning when Nick pointed out the presence of the collective pronoun and questioned what the we was invoking, whether it was some consensual collective world agency or and then Ben came back and said that he found both the we and the I, the punctured and perforated we and the I as problematic. I'm more interested in the we, or this impossible, inoperable we, which continually recurs in the text. And it links up to the idea that the logic of platforms or infrastructure is resistant to incremental negotiations. And I think there's a tendency to think of the democratic we as essentially an instigator of incremental negotiation. And what I'd like to do instead is to start by making what I think is a clear distinction between liberalism and democracy, because I think what in essence we might be dealing with here is a liberal system which is in crisis rather than a democratic system, which one hopes may be yet to come. And I'll speak to a book by Jean-Claude Michéa called The Empire of the Lesser Evil. And what Michéa says is that a liberal system is a system where parts of it are in fact infrastructure in a machine that is inaccessible to revision by the people, the majority, and so forth. And the two parts that he says are the economy and the fundamental constitutional laws. Those are off base, and that is in fact a system that we have in America now. And in the financial crisis, if we had this sort of democratic pragmatism, one could say, oh, we'll take over the banks, get rid of the toxic assets, you know, and then do whatever we need to do to get them right. But the Constitution was there to say one couldn't do that. And the Constitution is like a 200-year-old computer, which one essentially can't change in America. The Swedes rewrote their Constitution in 1975. But in essence, we don't really have any institutions that are democratic. And of course, that links to the question of what this impossible we that's going to essentially engage in the design project to kind of help transform a stack that it might be about accumulation at bottom into something else that is more ecologically sustainable and is more recognizant of all the non-human and machinic entities that form part of this this co-sphere that is taking place. The question of exit and voice then, I think, becomes central in the definition of the we, and I know Ben appeals to a notion of democracy occasionally as he talks about it, and I'm interested to see, to hear from him, what your conception of a democracy of the stack might be in the future that would somehow bring it to this kind of resource-friendly footprint that we may need to get to, and to Ben, to Nick's response too, as to whether, you know, who is the we to come, and how do we define that? And it seems to be invoked in the stack itself, in the notion of redesign. It's not the stack itself that's only going to do the redesigning. It'll be collaborating with something called the user position, which is either an infinity of individuals acting in and of themselves, or some sort of collectivity that we can't imagine.
Okay, so I'll go first. I guess the question, there's at least 2 or 3 questions here. One is whether or not you would prefer discussion of democracy of the means by which this operation may take place. What is how we might have democratic mechanisms that may produce unspecified outcomes, or what would be the means that would produce outcomes that we would understand as being democratic, and whether or not which has a higher priority for us. I guess in a certain sense, the values that I think would may define the more robustness principle of the networks that we'd be interested in would be, and you touched on many of these already, ones in which a kind of the capacity for some sort of ecological ongoingness may be understood as possible, that forms of the collapse of biodiversity that I think make note that are probably very difficult to understand as being preferable, systematically preferable over other alternatives might be reversed, not only reversed and sort of shifted away from the kind of entropic arc that they're on now, but maybe result in a greater diversity than may have been there before the start of the Anthropocene. For me, these are some of the sorts of goals, and we've talked, I think, a lot about these in various sorts of ways in the past. I think what I'm uncertain about, I'll sort of put it this way, is whether or not as to at what level of local or global something that we would recognize as something that we would take as democracy is the necessary structure for the outcomes of this. I think that there's a tendency to want to a tendency to presume, and I'm not saying you're necessarily making this presumption, but I think there's a tendency to presume that in order to arrive at a more satisfying and pre-guaranteed sense of a likely preferable outcome, that a certain self-transparency of the agencies that would be necessary to bring about this outcome would need to be guaranteed, and that and I think I don't mean this in the sense of identity necessarily, but perhaps in what you're talking about in terms of constitutionality, of a kind of baseline. You talked about it as a program. So if you think of constitutionality as a kind of baseline, a lower, in a more banal sense, a kind of operating system for a particular kind of system that has some kind of sovereign domain. The Westphalian model was this closed, had a certain sort of generic model for what that sovereign domain would be, the constitutionality being the baseline rules for which other kinds of subsequent rules would be organized around this. If the question then is like, okay, so if we are shifting, if Nick is correct in that we have to talk about these things in terms of an epochal shift from a modern order into something that's subsistence, what ultimately should what are the best candidates for that which steps into place for this underlying constitutional logic? What are the master algorithms that are necessary that may guarantee those kinds of outcomes with this as well? I don't have a set of commandments for this as well. I think that ones that other than what I elaborated in the whole third part of the book on a layer by layer basis, as to what each of these sort of might be. I think the ultimate issues probably are economic more than they are political. I think the relationship between ecology and economics is probably much more important for those goals than one between politics and culture, as we've talked about in a number of sorts of ways. The ways in which our economic systems produce our accumulated negative externalities, the way in which we are incapable of modeling the true costs of transactions into price signals, and the accumulation of distorted price signals, the ecological effects of those accumulated distortions, is something that needs to be rewritten, and there has to be a recoding of this as well. And, I think that blockchain systems may have a capacity to do this, but the capacity to do it is not just their decentralized capacities; it's their ability to have a sort of extremely granular addressability of instances and processes and actions that could be adjudicated in these kinds of ways. But again, for me, it's this conjunction of economics and ecology more than politics and culture, and it may be different for different people. If I'm taking your question correctly,
Nick, do you want to respond to that too?
Well, I really like the way the question is set up, because I think that this fundamental distinction, the decomposition of liberal democracy is the key ideological phenomenon of our age. And I think it's the way that Philip did that was exactly right. I mean, I would fall totally on the liberal side of the divide there. I mean, I think democracy is broken. I don't think there's any reason to think it works. And I think liberalism has been wrecked by democracy, and I'd like to see liberalism restored to being an experimental socio-technical economic system that will allow us to kind of sort through solutions. I don't think we can come to those things a priori. I don't think democracy is going to get them for us. I think what will get them is experimental government, to use Patrick Friedman's text or term or something like that. Stuff is tried, exit pressure is used to sift out stuff that fails. We end up with new ideas. If they work, they'll develop. If they don't work, they'll die. So that, in a nutshell, is my sense of that.
I think Genevieve also has a follow-up related question too.
Hey guys.
We have one in here which will take.
Okay, that's fine. You can go first.
No, Genevieve's all ready to go. So go ahead, Genevieve.
Oh, sorry guys, thanks. Sorry, okay. So yeah, this is maybe just more of like two things that, I don't even know how to pose them as a question, but just things I'm sort of grappling with. I like this idea, I've never heard about it, but when there is no exit from a commercial system, right? So the text, the Hirschman text. And that made me think immediately of crisis ordinary from like a Lauren Berlant literature perspective, which I know is on the cultural side, but it's sort of just, it made me think that entering into this moment, like a part of this paradigm shift, and then I'm linking this to like your descriptions of the user, which has no end, right? Like it's this infinite, it has no like final capture. I think, I forget which page it is on, but you know, it's not like a citizen or an economics subject. It's not clear, and it's kind of ongoing, right? So we enter into this like scape, which I don't know, like if that can be called a user scape that's unknowable, but in the end, like there is no exit coming from it, I guess, because if we don't know the parameters of it, there's no exit. And so I'm just sort of, yeah, I'm just trying to grapple with that in reference to agency, maybe, or like being able. So maybe I don't know exactly where to go with this, but these are. I was excited by the commercial system being united to an exit and value, I guess, that like ultimately we have this like unknowable potential scape of value that we are inherently like is not a part of the system structure right now.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's, I mean, I think you're innovating in an interesting way on Hirschman's thesis, and I think that's fine. In terms of this, I like the idea of the user escape as you identified here as well, in that it puts us in composite positions that may in fact interact with this way, but there's a regularity and pattern possible to understand with this as well, and there may be ways in which certain patterns within those composite positions, in which those positions will seek to enforce themselves in relationship to others and make claims for their own validity, which I think probably is a necessary function of what Nick's calling the experimental moment here. There has to be a point not just where in which there's inevitably a moment in which multiple experiments will seek to enforce their own results in relation to another, and to abstract their own successes from one domain onto another domain, and so forth, and that's the basis of their operation here. The question of exit from user is also an interesting one here. One of the things I talk about in the user layer also is one of the things about the user position that is both positive or negative, depending on how you see it, is that interaction with the interface layer will produce the position of the user, will organize that person or that thing or that agent or that instance into the structure of the user, whether it wants to or not.
Yeah.
And so for some people, under some circumstances, when other forms of agency, perhaps that they are not credentialized as a citizen by a parliamentary democracy and therefore are not allowed legal access to the system, the fact that the infrastructure will make them into a user, regardless of the absence of that other identity, is a net positive for them. They in fact have more agency than they would have had before. Under other circumstances, whether it's surveillance cameras or sensors or other sorts of things, you get essentially enrolled as a user whether or not you wish to or not, right? And so the fact that this production of the status of user is in a way automatic can be can be a function of producing greater agency for that person or place or thing, or less agency for that person. It doesn't guarantee one or the other. The interesting then is the question of exit from this is, under what circumstances are the terms by which a user position is produced, and they're never produced in exactly the same way, are the terms of that user position ones from which one may opt out or defer or escape or modify. And this is, I think I would agree that this is part of the question for the question is relative preferability may in fact be, and it also is a site of innovation of this as well. It shouldn't be seen just as a kind of purely sort of opt-out way in which sort of the crypto anarchists may see it as, I don't want to be interpolated as a user in this way, and therefore I'm going to opt out into some space of some non-space of freedom. There is no non-space of freedom, obviously, and so it's a question of not of exiting from one configuration into another configuration always and already. I see it less as a point.
Can anyone hear me right now?
Yeah,
Yes.
Ben's just gone, has he? Or,
Yeah, I think.
sorry, I just
Yeah,
lost
Nick, you
him.
want?
I can't hear him either. So let's just wait. He might come back, or we can maybe fill up this time with some of your responses, Nick, and then he'll probably join.
Who can't you hear?
Oh, we can hear you now, Ben.
Me?
Oh yeah, we couldn't hear you for a sec.
Did you hear my answer, or did I fall out?
Just the last 15
Okay.
seconds that I'm missing.
That's fine. Nick, do you want to jump in there, or can I add a question here from the class?
I don't know. There's a whole swirl of interesting stuff going on at the moment. So I'm not really sure. I mean,
Okay.
it was very quickly because Philip's got some stuff in the sidebar that I think ties up perhaps with what Genevieve was saying and with the previous question and what you've been saying, Ben, where if I can just quote the last bit of Philip's saying, he says, at some level, voice has to say yes or no to the larger directions of the stack. Now, I think this is a totally crucial point. I would contest that, but I totally recognize the importance of that claim because I think everything hinges on that, you know. And I think the question of whether exit can be transcendental is the final like philosophical stakes of this whole issue. You know, whether basically our political imaginary has as its horizon some resilient community of whatever scale, and therefore, because this is an inescapable framework of our existence, we have to get it right, and we are, in a certain sense, then perhaps propelled in the direction of voice. It becomes this urgent question, and obviously from the commercialized exit-oriented side, the thing looks totally different, and one has the fundamental structure of the political imaginary, if you wants to call it that, is radically fragmented. It's obviously not infinite, but it's in a certain sense boundless in the sense that it's dynamic, open-ended, experimental, multiplicitous. The horizons of optionality are open. You know, what could be tried, where what one could do, where one could try to settle, what kind of modes of existence one could exit into or opt into are not closed. And I think that those basic orientations are critical and at this great point of cleavage, really. And there's fantastic complications on both sides of it. I would definitely say I'm worried that this will sound sort of pointed, like a kind of poison pill type of thing. I don't mean like that, because it's just one part of the constellation. But I do think the kind of ethno-political enthusiasm of the current period is very much tied up with people having a bounded horizontal sense of resilient community, and with the resulting sense of like desperation, like, you know, if we don't control it, they'll control it, we'll be in it anyway, it's our destiny, everything's at stake. It's literally a cage match political structure. You know, one side is going to win or lose over this closed, enclosing political space, and sort of the intensity of the political conflict is raised occasionally. And the exit model in this sense is an attempt to just really just chill everything right down by saying, you know, if people want to do X, Y, or Z, you know, you have to find a way of making that not your concern. If it's totally critical and crucial and hysterically important to you what other people are doing, then there's going to be trouble. So the kind of the craft of this geopolitical system is to try and actually diffuse the intensity of concern you have with what other groups of people are, the choices that they are making, I think. And so I would just say, in terms of back just very quickly to Philip's thing, that I just do not think it's right that you have to say yes in large directions to the stack. If the stack is some totalistic thing that's blotting out the horizon, that is your problem. Instead, you have to try and just fragment the situation down so that things can go in different directions. They can be sifted by competition, they can be subject to selective forces, and you can use exit pressure in order to dissent from that.
Well, Ben, do you have a student waiting to ask a question, or am I allowed to speak?
Do you want to ask? Either way, let me just also sort of say is I think there's probably two different things. Just a response to Nick's point, which I got about half of what he was saying because of bandwidth issues here.
Sorry about that.
I think it may be just as much on our end. I think there's two different things. Two different things that work here. It's not that there is no escape from the stack as such, and that therefore exit from one position is therefore already captured into something else because the stack is total. But rather, this is, I think, just a condition. It's not about the political backdrop of this. It is more to do just with the ecological and planetary backdrop of it. There is no outside period, and therefore there is no, and therefore any exit is always contextual and conditional. Exit from something into a different state, and so if that's what you mean by, if a transcendental exit would be one that is truly an escape not only from a particular situation and context, but an escape from situation and context as such into a space of absolute freedom, like at the end of THX 1138.
Yeah, no, that's not what I mean by it. That's not what I mean by it. I mean it's fundamental irreducibility to voice and
right. Got it. Okay. So
predominance of domestic politics. I think it's, you know, I'm not going to.
Yeah, I think
I've said a lot already, but I just want to say I think the fact that you start with geopolitics is totally right. I think you can set this whole thing up to say it's like domestic and geopolitics.
It's totally what?
You can totally set this thing up by talking about domestic and geopolitics. You know, like, is it the fundamental question is which comes first, international relations theory or domestic politics? There's one model of it that the whole world is one big polity waiting to happen, and that all of international relations theory finally fold into some kind of global collective domestic politics. And the absolute opposite exit model policy is that international relations theory, fracture, fragmentation, multiplicity is the bedrock, and the point is actually to use those forces of leverage to actually pull domestic politics to pieces. You know, and so yes, I think that's the.
No, yeah, it's not. I think I make sort of pretty careful to sort of make a pretty strong critique of the Kantian cosmopolitan model by which everything gets folded into the domestic. It's not about the production of another absolute political interior. It's the proliferation of multiple totalities on top of one another, intersecting with one another, that is I taking as the new normal, as the precondition. What I meant is the planetary backdrop was really just this. It's just to do with the fact that there's a scarcity of perch and space upon which that multiplicity takes place. I'm not conflating the political and the ecological.
Yeah, no, I wasn't attributing that. I wasn't attributing domestic totalitarianism to.
I'm sorry. I'm getting like every fourth word. So I mean, this is what a student here in the class, and then we'll go back. Go ahead. Okay, so attempt to bridge the discussion from where we are now to where we would go.
The question came up with when you talk about the process of platforms and authoritarian response, that kind of authoritarian.
Yeah.
The question in regards to that in terms of democracy, and how
To this question of what do we do? What is it? Yeah. So if I can simplify it just real quickly, I'll try. It's a complex question, but in general, what would, if we're from this catalyst, the legacies of all of the Westphalian of Westphalian identity, of which politics and the distinction between national and international, domestic and foreign, and so forth and so on, as a kind of zero-sum cage match that Nick has described.
Hey, Ben.
If Ben leaves the Hangout and come back, it'll pick up.
Towards, I guess I this would sort of you jump in there?
Ben, can you hear me?
Mohammed, you there?
Can you hear me now?
Ben, maybe you can leave the Hangout and come back. Leave the Hangout and come back so it refreshes for you.
Log out and come back. Okay.
Close it and come back, because I think sometimes it increases the speed when your machine is like slowing down.
You need.
So we also have a, if you can hear me.
We can.
Okay, we have stop here at 1. We actually need to stop it as well. So I'm wondering if we have any last remarks. We can follow up on this as well. Mohammed, I want to, so we have like what the stop here at 1 as I sort of suggested. Did you want to say anything to kind of wrap it?
Yes, thank you for asking me. I would like to just maybe, I think one of the most important contributions from Nick's presentation today, which I completely agree with him. I disagree with a lot of things that Nick said even tonight, but we're going to leave that for other sessions. But what I think was really important is this major transformation that he basically argued that we're going through, which is reminiscent of what basically end of the large modern era and the beginning of a whole new ball game that we have not seen for 500-600 years, something similar to it. And I think this is what, the kind of question that Philip asked at the end, I think it misses the enormity of this, to me, fact.
Poor Philip.
That this transformation requires a whole new way of so the question is not about do we get an ultimate say to say yes or no, but even if you want to put it in those terms, you want to talk about on what sorts of organizational argument rhetoric, infrastructure we're able to have any kind of say in the stack to actually say no, even if the answer is no. And you know what I mean? It's like we're not even like thinking that you can actually have a yes no say is a 20th century fantasy or 19th century fantasy or an Enlightenment fantasy that we no longer can afford to have, because it's just going to waste our time even more. So that, and also the fact that these shifts that Nick talks about have been highlighted by few very important art historians and people who look at the materiality of our worldview. And for instance, Alua Regal will be the best example of it, because for him, the emergence of modern art and Picasso is already the sign of the end of this 500-600 year period. So if we go by this art history version, you have this, like basically the entire 20th century has been the crisis period itself. And now it's like the poem is going away, and then we're actually realizing that we're in a deep crisis. Modern era is ending. So there's like a lot of like work done in art actually that actually see things the same way that Nick does. Anyways, so I'm not gonna like prolong it, but I can put some of the references in a classroom for people to read later.
Yeah.
So yeah, so if we're ready to wrap up, because I don't have the close.
Okay. So
if there's nobody else needing to say anything urgent, I think maybe Theodore can close the class.
Okay. So before this, just say thanks to Nick for staying up late and being a good sport and a good conversation.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'd just like to really thank Ben for the book, which is just terrific, and obviously everyone should read it.
Absolutely.
Really important book, and I've really enjoyed myself. So thanks everyone who's been involved.
So Ben, before we all go, can we agree on 17 or 18 as the last session of the class? Would that work for you? If you can't, oh. I'm not sure if Ben is there.
I think we may have lost him again. Hey Ben, can you hear us?
Okay, we can talk about it later.
Okay.
So maybe you want to just close the class, Theodore.
Great.
Or like stop the recording.
Yeah. All right. Thanks everyone. Thanks Nick.
Okay.
Thank you, Nick.
Bye. Thanks
Oh, no, he's
everyone.
here, but I
Have a
think he passed.
good new regime.
Election.
Yeah. Yeah, very historic too to have.
Okay.
this discussion
Bye, everyone.
right?
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.